Welcome, everybody. My name is Radha Govil. I'm the Deputy Director at the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness, where one of the things I do is have the great pleasure of doing is convening this relatively recently formed network of scholars and researchers on statelessness in the Asia Pacific, hence the name Statelessness Asia Pacific Research Network. I was just talking to Micah before, and we've realized that we're up to meeting number 7. So this initiative was launched early last year, and we've had quarterly meetings, and they've been really interesting and an opportunity for brilliant researchers working on various citizenship and statelessness issues in the region to share either their works in progress or completed research and have an exchange with other members. We do hope at some point that we'll have the time and space and energy to make some applications for funding so that our members can find ways to collaborate and do more than just meet on a quarterly basis, but we're yet to get to that point, but always very open to your ideas. Um, I would be amiss if I went further without first acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, at least those of us in Melbourne are. But for those who are joining us from further afield, in Australia, but also in the region and beyond, it's an important acknowledgement that we need to make that a lot of dispossession has happened in Australia of Indigenous people, their lands, and therefore parts of their legal identity. And it's something that we bear in mind as we do our own research on issues of statelessness with Indigenous communities in other parts of the region, as well as non-Indigenous communities. Before we introduce our speakers and the topic today, I actually thought we'd move the agenda item, any other business, up to the top because there's one specific request of the membership that we'd like to make, and I don't want to miss the opportunity of doing so if we do run a little bit later because of the interest in our speakers. And that is to mention to all of you that Christoph, who's also online, as you can see, and myself are co-editing the June 2026 edition of the Melbourne Asia Review, which is a journal initiative of the Asia Institute based at the University of Melbourne. And this publication sort of seeks to fill a lacuna in academically informed articles, but which are directed towards a more policy-oriented audience. So the articles are fairly short and sharp, but they are meant to be academically rigorous and touch on an array of topics. The reason that Christoph and I have been asked to co-edit the June 2026 edition is that the Melbourne Asia Review have decided to focus that edition on issues of statelessness, largely in the Asia Pacific region. So we actually have been able to commission articles from authors throughout the region. But the reason I thought I would raise it here, and I should say that the call was put out to this group as well, and I think a few people who are part of the SAP Research Network are contributing to that edition. But now the call is to see if there'd be anyone who'd be interested in reviewing the articles. And before I go further, it's not a steep ask. The articles are short; they're 2,000 to 2,500 words. So your review would be commensurately short, probably no more than 300 to 400 word, fairly high level review, and you get a chance to read hopefully a really interesting but effective and short article. So if anyone's interested in taking on that role, that would be from sort of mid-February next year onwards. You'd have a few weeks to review a short article. So if you're interested in playing that role, just pop myself or Micah at the Centre on Statelessness a message, and we'll get in touch with you to provide you with the details as to how you can do that review. But that was just a request to everyone who's on the call, and we'll write to the broader membership as well to see if there's that interest. So on to today's meeting and the topic for today's meeting. And just by way of a little bit of background, some of you may be aware that one of the ways in which the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness explores issues of statelessness in the region is through our briefing paper series. If you go onto our website and check the briefing paper series, you'll see that briefing papers have been issued on topics as varied as statelessness in India, recent constitutional amendments that were made in Malaysia, and on the recently adopted Australia Tuvalu Fali Treaty, amongst others. And when we were thinking about sort of other briefing papers that we would like to put out, the purpose of the briefing paper is to sort of provide an expert view and an in-depth sort of dive into a specific and sometimes quite narrow statelessness issue that the general public or other researchers and academics might be interested in. When we're thinking about what other topics we'd like to canvass through this briefing paper series, one of the topics that came right up at the top of the list was the situation of the Rohingya and their citizenship, particularly in post-coup Myanmar. Our sense at the centre was that quite a lot has been written about Rohingya citizenship over the years, particularly prior to the coup. And interestingly, most of the literature that touches on statelessness has been more in the context of sort of the various humanitarian crises that have unfortunately affected the Rohingya community in Myanmar, as well as beyond where they've had the countries to which they've had to flee, in particular Bangladesh and Myanmar, with a focus very much on their rights. But we felt that what was missing from the landscape, particularly in recent times, was an exploration of what citizenship, and in particular Myanmar citizenship, for the Rohingya look like in the post-coup scenario, and what, if any, possibilities for moving forward in a positive way in relation to looking at Myanmar citizenship for the Rohingya, what opportunities and avenues there might be. And for that reason, our centre decided to team up with the Myanmar Research Network, which is another network that is established at the University of Melbourne, to talk about how we could kind of start researching to develop a briefing note or briefing notes in this area. And very fortunately for us, two of the members of the Myanmar Research Network who are with us today to present, Matthew Schisler and Sophia Twe, are brilliant scholars. Matt has recently completed his PhD, and Sophia is to do so imminently. Had some really incredible insights into this very topic, which we thought was something that needed to be explored. So it's my great pleasure to actually introduce shortly to you both Matt and Sophia, and then ask them to introduce two papers, actually. So we got two for the price of one, in the sense of we thought we'd be working on one briefing paper, but we found that there was such rich material and quite different aspects of this question that needed to be examined, that we're looking at sort of two papers that are due to be published in early 2026. But to give you a sense of their work in progress, we have Matt and Sophia here to talk about different aspects of this question of Rohingya citizenship in Myanmar, in post-coup Myanmar. So what I'll do is I'll first introduce both Matt and Sophia, and then I think Matt will present his paper or work in progress first, and then followed by Sophia, and then we'll have time for some Q&A with both of them. So without further ado, let me introduce Matt, who is Dr. Matt Schisler. Congratulations, Matt, a visiting fellow at the Australian National University, ANU. Matt has worked on a range of issues of state violence, religion, and technology in Myanmar for nearly 2 decades now, including 8 years as a member of a local human rights organisation, as well as other civil society organisations. He recently completed his PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan, where his dissertation focused on the history of the Rohingya genocide, and he also holds a master's in international human rights law from the University of Oxford. So thanks very much for joining us, Matt. And Sophia Twe is a PhD candidate in conflict and peace studies at the University of Melbourne. She's researching the politics of peace building in the Rohingya conflict. Her work focuses on post-coup conflict dynamics in Myanmar's Rakhine state, including rebel governance, ethno-nationalism, citizenship, identity politics, and nation building. And her research interests include the intersections of conflict, development, and humanitarianism, with particular attention to struggles for self-determination, rights, and justice among minority, Indigenous, and marginalised communities. So with that, I'll pass over to Matt, who I think both Matt and Sophia have presentations to share on their screens. But Matt, I'll let you know when you're nearing your 20-minute mark, if that's okay.
Well, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to share the research and inviting me to do the research with PMCS. I've been really enjoying it. I want to do a couple things today, but in the main, it's really just to focus on the importance of getting some seemingly minor empirical details about the history of Rohingya citizenship and statelessness correct. And I think that this kind of empiricism is important, just full stop. It's important, should be a part of the activist and practitioner work. It's a part of being a good historian and anthropologist, the way that I think of myself as a scholar. But I also think there's something kind of unique about the current moment in Myanmar that makes the particular details that I want to highlight and maybe kind of correct the record, as it were, very important right now, more so than ever before, perhaps. And so that's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with the current moment in Myanmar and talk a little, sets up why or what I'm going to say is so important, why it will be so important. And then I want to work through a little bit of how the Rohingya have been made stateless, which is kind of the standard account, you could say. And then I'm going to change that account and introduce some new material that I don't think we have paid nearly enough attention to. So I think, as probably everyone is aware, there's a military coup in 2021 that followed about a decade of democratic opening in Myanmar, which itself followed 20 years of military dictatorship, which followed on 40 years of socialist dictatorship. So Myanmar's had a long odyssey of democratic struggles and authoritarian rule. In 2021, when the coup occurred, there was an explosion and just an explosive popular response, really unlike many previous protest generations, although we've had major protests in every generation since the beginning of the socialist dictatorship in the 60s. And one of the features of this that was really striking at the time, just in the weeks after the coup, as the street demonstrations were starting, were really prominent apologies to the Rohingya. And so you can see a few that were out on the streets in the days after the military coup in February of 2021. And those uh, were on street signs. You had, these are just a couple that I pulled off Twitter just in the hours before this presentation right now. But you had a lot of other high profile examples. So you had members of elected parliament that had just been, an election had occurred in 2020 and the military coup occurred in response to its defeat in that victory. And so many members who had just been elected to parliament, who were being deposed by the coup, announced formal apologies to the Rohingya. You had formal apologies from many of the prominent student unions, which have been a locus of political activity in Myanmar for decades. You had prominent apologies from other political figures. And then you had a whole series of really amazing things happen that had never really happened. So uh, as the coup movement grew into an armed revolution, now you have an armed revolution in Myanmar in which various armed groups control probably more territory than the central state does, or at least are able to contest it substantially. And Sophia is going to be talking about that situation in Western Myanmar specifically. You also had a massive labor uprising, national strikes, political movements, the formation of a competing government with a claim to legitimacy over the country's sovereignty and political organs. And that organization, which is now called the National Unity Government, appointed a Rohingya minister for the first time. And you saw then the development of a new constitution very soon after. Oh, and then you saw the NUG made announcements, not quite apologies, but promises to grant citizenship to the Rohingya. So in June 2021, so if you're following along, less than 6 months after the coup, the competing government, the revolutionary government, we will say now, announced that it would grant full citizenship to the Rohingya, that it would repeal the citizenship law that was adopted in 1982, which we'll be talking about quite a bit, that it would abolish the process of issuing national verification cards, which we'll also be talking about in a moment. These are the processes and the laws that have been weaponized to deny the Rohingya citizenship. So it was a massive announcement for the National Unity Government to announce these kind of promises. It was also incredibly significant that they just used the word Rohingya at all. So you can see underlined there, the word Rohingya is occurring all over this statement, and this is just one of a number of statements that the National Unity Government released. To even use the word Rohingya before June of 2021 was a near suicide pact for many people in Myanmar. It was incredibly controversial just to say the word. You could not, I mean, as someone who was working in Myanmar in the 2000s and the 2010s, it was very difficult, even among, you can imagine, the most progressive political human rights and democracy activists, to even say the word would be either a cause of fury, or at least someone to say, hey, hold on, that's going to be too controversial. Let's find another way to talk about that. So to begin seeing it discussed at kind of this new center of power was extremely exciting. And so I just want to underscore that in this moment, we have probably the broadest coalition that there has ever been in post-colonial Myanmar history for a political struggle that is challenging military rule, which is primarily associated with the Burman majority and the Buddhist majority. And that challenge is reaching deep into the kind of social fabric of contemporary life in Myanmar, challenging norms around ethnicity, religion, gender. And there's lots of different ways that has occurred, and I'm happy to talk about many of them. But it has also included the Rohingya. At the same time, I think there have been a lot of people who have questioned the sincerity and the seriousness of these kinds of moves. You'll note, for example, in those demonstration posters that I showed on the first slide, those are all in English. So those are very self-consciously for a foreign English reading audience to photograph and circulate that. Many of the members of the political movement, of the revolutionary political movement, have sought to position themselves as champions of human rights and democracy as a means for winning international support. And everyone is aware that their lack of solidarity with the Rohingya in previous years has been a major barrier to continued support. So remedying the perception of the NUG as potentially anti-Rohingya is absolutely vital for its future success in the revolution, or at least its future ability to win support from Western and other audiences. And this becomes a serious potential problem when we look at something like the Federal Democracy Charter. So fairly quickly after the anti-coup movement began to develop in 2021, there was a committee that was convened to draft a charter, a new constitution, which would be on federal principles, which the aim of which was to shift the relationship between the majority Burman heartland and different ethnic minority groups who are in states that are named after ethnic majority populations of those states around the country's periphery. And it was on the basis of that, actually, that there was a legitimacy for forming the national unity government as a kind of caretaker government for this new democracy charter. It's been subsequently modified in minor ways, and it continues to be a major subject of discussion and debate. What is the formation of the organization of political authority in a future Myanmar in which the revolution is successful in some way? The problem is that when we look at the terms of the charter itself, it on purpose or accidentally smuggles in some of the same problematic vocabulary that has been there all along. So if we look at the section on the fundamental rights of ethnic minorities, for example, you'll see what I've sidelined in red. You'll see the recurring use of the phrase ethnic nationalities. Now, to an English reader, you might see this and just say, oh, this is talking about just diverse peoples in Myanmar who are all citizens. But the phrase in Burmese ethnic nationality is Dayantha, and Dayantha is a term that is freighted with extreme significance. It's the term that has defined the basis of citizenship in Myanmar since 1982. And that's what I'll talk about next. So in the standard account of Rohingya statelessness, we have a long timeline, right? It goes all the way back to 1942 when there's potentially, you could say, a kind of communal conflict among Rohingya armed groups that had sided with the British and other armed groups that had sided with the Japanese as they were withdrawing from Burma near the end of the war. You have different moments of persecution, most famously in 1978, Operation Dragon King, a military operation which drove hundreds of thousands of Rohingya into Bangladesh. In 1982, you have the adoption of a new citizenship law, which is often said to have made the Rohingya no longer citizens, and that's why I've circled it. In almost all accounts of the Rohingya statelessness and the Rohingya genocide, 1982 is a pivotal turning point. It's said to be, in some ways, a legal follow-up to the military operation in 1978, and which is then escalated over subsequent decades. And the reason the 1982 law is so significant is because for the first time in the history of Myanmar, the 1982 law instituted a multi-tiered system of citizenship. So there was a sort of top-level form of citizen, which is colloquially generally referred to as to be a full citizen. This is someone who can hold elected office, can attain the highest forms of education, can purchase property, can inherit property, can have their citizenship can never be revoked or rejected. And then there are two lower tiers of citizenship, associate citizen and naturalized citizen. Now, in previous versions of Myanmar's citizenship regime, there were many different ways that one could become a citizen. One could naturalize, one could be a citizen by birth. But the different pathways to citizenship all led to the same single form of citizenship. Once one became a citizen, one was a citizen as much as any other. The 1982 law created the tiered system in which only some people could have full citizenship. And so you can imagine in a country where, for example, there have been decades of democratic struggle, resistance to an authoritarian government, the possibility that one's citizenship could be dissolved is an extreme risk. So if one is politically active and is not a citizen by birth and is arrested, then one can have one's citizenship stripped on account of one's political activities. Not to mention all of the other reasons why having citizenship is important pragmatically for buying property, marrying, getting education, etc. Now, how does one become a full citizen or an associate citizen or a naturalized citizen? There's a lot of work been done on this, so I'm going to spare us all a detailed explanation. But the primary difference, the crucial difference, is that the only person who can become a full citizen is one who is born to a recognized ethnic nationality in the country. And this is that phrase, nationality, that I was pointing to in the new federal democracy charter that continues. This is the phrase in Burmese, Dayantha. So one must be the child of two parents who were themselves recognized as Dayantha. And if your parents are of a recognized ethnic nationality group, then you can be a full citizen. If your parents were not members of a recognized ethnic nationality group, then you cannot be a full citizen, but you can be an associate citizen or a naturalized citizen. Now, there are a variety of legal debates about the exact meaning of these laws, about whether someone who was a citizen under previous laws prior to 1982 would remain a citizen. And according to the 1982 law, yes, one would remain a citizen. But the important detail is that once this law created the opportunity for weaponizing citizenship and statelessness in a fundamentally new way. So it led to the development of what was called a citizenship scrutiny process. And you had a color-coded set of citizenship ID cards, which began being issued. So the pink cards were the cards for someone who is a full citizen. The blue cards were for someone who was an associate citizen, and the green cards were for someone who is naturalized as a citizen. These cards replaced prior forms of documentation, such as the national registration card, which is on the top, which is a registration card that belonged to a Rohingya man. Many Rohingya had those earlier forms of citizenship, but when the citizenship scrutiny process began under the terms of the new law, they began being systematically excluded from registration. And we often talk about statelessness as something that involves not just law, but also practice. But in some ways, I actually want to highlight the significance of the law as necessary to the practice in this case. The law created a very high set of documentary requirements for a person to be able to register as a citizen. And it required, or it enabled the state to require this of anyone that it wanted to, really at any time. So in order to get your full citizenship card for the first time, one had to go through that registration process. And if one was a Burmese Buddhist from a heartland area without a lot of rebel activity, for example, it was a lot easier to get one of these citizenship cards, a pink card, than if one was from another part of the country. And if one was Rohingya, then it became almost impossible, even if one had the documentation. The best book that we have on this by Natalie Brenham, which just came out recently, documents all the many practices that were used to implement this law. So checkpoints, which became very common throughout the 1990s in Rakhine State, for example, were used to seize many of the documents from Rohingya that they would have used to then complete the registration process. And having had those documents taken from them, they had then no evidentiary basis on which to proceed through the registration process. It's just one of many, many examples. But what I want to raise, the thing that I would like to rehistoricize, is the question of who got to be an ethnic nationality in the first place. If we can think of this as kind of a funnel, winnowing out lots of people who become ineligible for this new form of pink identity card, the funnel becomes narrowed down to only those who are ethnic nationalities, which leads to the definitional question of who is an ethnic nationality such that they can claim full citizenship and get these forms of documentation and all the opportunities that follow. So if we go back to the standard account, 1982, the law is adopted, which introduces the three-tier system. One can be a citizen, a full citizen, only if one is a recognized ethnic nationality. The problem is, and this is the first minor detail that I want to highlight, is that when the law was announced in 1982, it did not provide any definition, any exhaustive definition of who would be an ethnic nationality. So on the right of the slide, you can see the relevant passage from the law. It says nationals such as Kachin, Kaya, Karen, Chin, Burman, Mon, Rakhine, or Shan. These are all the largest ethnic minority groups in Myanmar, all of whom align with a state in the country. So there is a Kachin state, a Kaya state, a Karen state, a Chin state. Not a Burman state. The central heartland areas are all associated with the Burmans. Mon, Rakhine, and Shan each have their own regional state. But the important thing is that it also has and it says and other ethnic groups settled in any of the territories included within the state as their permanent home from the period of 1823, which is the period of the first invasion by the British. Which just leaves the question in legal terms undefined. Now, in almost every account by academics and practitioners, the assumption has been that the law defined who the ethnic nationality groups were. And you'll see references like the reference on the left from one of the NGO reports that I used to illustrate this presentation refers to a list of 135 ethnic groups, which was published in 1990. Now, the interesting thing is what that leaves us with is a gap of some 8 years. And I've never really seen anyone ask what happened during this gap of 8 years. The best account we have, the single best account we have of the history of citizenship categories in Myanmar comes from Nick Cheeseman, who's at the ANU. And he did a genealogy of these, of the Dayantha, the ethnic nationalities category. And he points to 1990, as does the NGO report based on his article, points to a 1990 edition of the state-owned newspaper, the Working People's Daily, which is referenced also by the government. So when the Deputy Minister of Immigration, for example, was asked ahead of a census in 2014, what was the basis for who created the list of 135 groups, the Deputy Minister could only point to a 1990 article from the Working People's Daily, which said the list is 135. So if the definition of ethnic nationality is so absolutely central to citizenship, the question that I have not answered, the empirical question I don't think anyone can answer, is why the government would have invested so much in developing a new legal framework in 1982 and then taking no further steps to clarify who it applied to over the next 8 years. But it turns out that the Myanmar government has also wondered this. Who can be an ethnic nationality? So before that announcement in the Working People's Daily in September of 1990, in June of 1989, in a long series of articles that were serialized over a few weeks of June 1989, the same journal, the Working People's Daily, which was the long serial was explaining the workings of the Myanmar citizenship laws, said that they had not yet clarified who the Dayantha would include. They had not yet clarified who the ethnic nationalities would be. So if we're following along, this is a pretty massive thing for the Myanmar government to have announced in 1989. Because it means that as of June 1989, it was not yet possible to say who was not a Myanmar citizen. The terms of the law, when it was adopted in 1982, made it possible to say that the main ethnic groups, Kachin, Kaya, Karen, Mon, Shan, etc., were all Dayantha, and that the children born of two parents of one of those groups were full citizen. But it just said that there were other groups that needed to be clarified later. And as of June 1989, that list was still unspecified. It makes sense that this is the date that they would have been saying the list had not yet been clarified, that as late as June 1989, it was unclarified, because it's only in the next year that the citizenship scrutiny process begins to be implemented by the Myanmar government. So the law was adopted in 1982, and for the next 8 or so years, very little was done to enforce it upon the citizens of Myanmar. In 1989 and 1990, the government began rolling out citizenship scrutiny, not only for Rohingya, but for people all across the country. And so it makes sense that they would be publishing a serialized series of articles to explain how the citizenship regime works because they were just beginning to implement it for the first time. And it makes sense that all the documentation, like in Natalie's book, shows that the citizenship scrutiny cards began being issued in that period, and the national registration cards and other forms of documentation began being seized, especially in that period, although they had been seized in earlier times. So there's some kind of shift that is occurring in 1989, 1990, which is unlike anything before, and which is beginning a new period of activity after a relative period of non-activity following the passage of the law. Now, it makes perfect sense that that would occur because in 1988, we had the end of socialist rule in Myanmar. So from the 60s through 1988, Myanmar had been a one-party socialist country. There was a democratic uprising in 1988, which caused the fall of that regime, led by a guy named General Ne Win. You'll see the black and white photo of him on the top right. And he was replaced by briefly a general named Sa Mong in the small photo, and then for the next 2 decades, General Than Shwe, who was the leading general, the ruler of Myanmar until handing over power to in the beginning of the democratic decade that we had in the 2010s. At that time, in 1989 and 1990, when the Myanmar government was announcing it had not yet defined the Dayan Tha category, and then when it was changing its mind or announcing it had in September 1990, finally defined it, lots of other things were happening. That was the same year that the name Burma was changed to Myanmar. That actually also occurred in June 1989. A month before the Dayan Tha, the article about citizenship laws had been announced in May of 1989 was the announcement of a new election. Those elections were held in May 1990. They were annulled in July of 1990. And then just 3 months after they were annulled, or 2 months after they were annulled, was the announcement in September of 1990 clarifying that who was and who was not at Dayan Tha. And it's that list that excludes the Rohingya. The period of 1989 and 1990 is a period of massive change in Myanmar, as one would expect in any country which has ended decades of socialist rule and is replacing socialist rule with new forms of social organization and politics. A kind of Buddhist nationalism, a Buddhist culture program, as it's called in Burmese, replaces socialism as the ruling national ideology. And there's an investment in all kinds of shifts and changes in the names of everything from streets to towns to states and regions to the whole country. So it makes sense that at the same moment, they would be finally clarifying who is at Dayan Tha. But it remains significant that for those previous 8 years, Dayan Tha had not been clarified. And it was not possible to say that the Rohingya could not be full citizens until September of 1990. This is the first reason why I think these minor details are so incredibly important. Because if we realize that the Dayan Tha category, the current understanding of the Dayan Tha category as including 135 national groups and 135 national groups that do not include the Rohingya, if we realize that that is an artifact of September 1990, then we also realize it's an artifact of the transition between the guy in the top right, Ne Win, to the guy in the bottom right, Dan Shui. It's an artifact of that exact moment of post-socialist transformation in which a new ruling ideology was being developed and was being implemented by the military that would rule the country for the next 20 years. And that is extremely significant right now because all of the political activity that has occurred after the 2021 coup is oriented towards a rejection of those 2 decades. The rejections of forms of gender ideology, racial and ethnic ideology, ideologies of religion, religious and Buddhist dominance. These are all things that are associated with the SLORC and the SPDC as the acronyms for the military in those years is named. And so if we recognize that the Rohingyas' exclusion from citizenship is also an artifact of that period, then all of the investment in rejecting and questioning those periods also then begins to encompass a rejection of the citizenship regime that has excluded the Rohingya. Conversely, and the major problem that I see with timelines, like the non-annotated version that I have up here, is that it makes the exclusion of Rohingya citizenship appear as if it's always been there. The persecution of the Rohingya goes back to 1942. It's a shallower but still similar version of the kind of age-old hatreds narrative that we should all know better if we looked at the shallow analysis of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, violence in Rwanda, and many, many other cases. The historical depth with which these things are claimed to the historical depth with which these things are claimed to reach also functions as a kind of rigidity and an idea that these things are intractable, that the Rohingya have never been a part of Myanmar. But historically, that's just not true. They have been made not a part of Myanmar, especially since 1990. The second thing I would want to highlight is that if we realize that the exclusion of the Rohingya from the Dayan category begins in 1990, we can also then begin to see all of the many other forms of inclusion that predated it. So this, for example, is an issue of the journal Shootout from 1971. Shootout was a Burmese journal, it means viewpoint, and it was published, this article was published on the anniversary of the Banglong Conference. And that is a conference which brought together many of the different ethnic nationalities in Burma and the Burmese from the central heartlands to form a coalition that would agree to work together to fight against the British. National Union Day is a day to celebrate unity among these different peoples. And every year at this time, early on or midway through the socialist period, this newspaper published a special issue about unity among the different ethnic groups. On the left, what I have circled is a poem. The poem is called Our Tayantha, and the poem consists mostly of a list of many different Tayantha groups. Shan, Kachin, Mon, Bama, all of those, but also the Rohingya. My point is that there were many and multiple efforts or assumptions that the Rohingya were a part of the national ethnic nationalities category as it could be used in Myanmar during previous decades. We can make a timeline of it. So, for example, in 1973, there was a census which used 144 rather than 135. That list of 144 did not include the Rohingya as a name, but it included other groups that are very similar to the Rohingya, and I think which certainly at the time Rohingya political organizations were willing to be encompassed under. You had other examples like the Shootout article that I have from 1971 in the 1960s, which included 160, and another example, 50. These are all Nick Cheesman's article if you're interested. And my point is that in 1990, when the new military dictatorship, the post-socialist dictatorship, was choosing how to define the ethnic nationality category, it deliberately chose to reject these earlier and more inclusive versions of ethnic nationality. It decided to winnow them down from other categories, like other lists of 160 or 144, to include 135, not including the Rohingya. Retroactively, it asserted that that list is based upon a list used to enumerate a non-published list used to enumerate the 1983 census, which is true. The 1983 census did use a list of 135, which did not include the Rohingya. But there's no legal basis for asserting that the census provides the legal meaning to the term nationality per the terms of the new law. And there's no reason then that the 1983 census had to be used over the 1973 census or any of the other lists that remained available in 1990. And I suppose then this is why I think getting the details is so important. Getting the details right is so important for historians and anthropologists, because with the exception of Nick's article and a few others, almost every single timeline, almost every single historical account, almost every briefer of the Rohingya genocide and Rohingya statelessness repeats the claim that the citizenship law in 1982 denied the Rohingya of citizenship because it instituted the category of 135. The best accounts that we have acknowledge that 1990 is the moment when the Rohingya were excluded from the list. But I've never seen anything that asks about the period between 1982 and 1990, nor takes seriously the existence of all of these many other lists that would have been available to the military regime in 1990 when it decided to exclude the Rohingya. So I think these kinds of things are important for the political moment. We can highlight them. We can emphasize them to Myanmar activists and other scholars when we say that their current project to challenge the history, the artifacts of the military regime necessarily includes a challenge to the category of Tayantha that excludes the Rohingya. And we can also begin using that in our conversations of things like the Federal Democratic Charter. But I'll end here because I want to make sure we have enough time for Sophia, and I'm happy to chat more.
Amazing, Matt. Thank you so much. We've had, a number of chats. We had a recent workshop on this, and it's just brilliant to see you lay this out so clearly, this argument that you're making, which is in many ways a novel argument because it pulls together so many different strands and a compelling one. And I think you've linked it amazingly to the relevance of this kind of intricate historical understanding and misunderstanding that has informed so much of contemporary practice and activism today. And I mean, I've got a bunch of questions, but we'll have questions, I think, after Sophia's also presented. So we're going to move from sort of this forensic examination of the history and often what's used as the basis for the claim that the Rohingya have been excluded for all time from Myanmar citizenship through to a very contemporary account of what the lay of the land looks like now, who are the competing power brokers in Rakhine State, and what does that mean for Rohingya citizenship? Also taking into account what Matt has provided. So over to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was really interesting. And even myself, I is eye-opening some of the history because it's actually is really interesting the point you have made, like especially this like our dying that's Poland's and all other things, which I'm not aware. So which is really good to learn. And so for my part, like Matt already mentioned, my research is also focused on the post-coup dynamic or the Arakan and Rohingya conflict. And so today I just would like to talk about a little bit of the Arakan army governance structures and as well as the implication for the citizenship in post-coup, in particularly in Rakhine Rohingya dimension and not the central power the dimension. So the outline is like Rohingya in the current Rakhine State context. And so in the Arakan army, as we all know, the post-coup dynamic has been really a lot of political changes happen, particularly in Rakhine State. And also because of the Arakan army started having a lot of territory control, and you can see here the map and they already control some and these all these red areas and only the green part, only three townships is under the SAC control area. So a lot of these states territories are under the Arakan army at the moment. And also that we have seen and after the coup in particularly in 2021 and between 23 and the Arakan army as well as the engagement between the Arakan army and within Rohingya community inside particularly has been a lot of changes happened. And also, the Rohingya and Arakan army, they were having a lot of including the Rohingya community in the local administrations and a lot of positive change, also social cohesion part. They were promoting these like football and a lot of social cohesion. But at the same time, at the community level, we could also see these like Arakan army, they started having Muslim affair committees and under the AA control areas. And so we were more positive and we were seeing a lot of positive things and hopeful at the moment, particularly in 2021 and 2023. But however, at the same time, there's a lot of challenges for the Rohingya communities, especially from the and this like to having the dual authority and also parallel governance. So they had a lot of financial burdens and also how to navigate the tension between Arakan army and SAC as well. At the same time, we seen that especially when Arakan army started control a lot of territory in Rakhine State, the military, as we all know, they are pretty good at exploiting and divided rule strategies in Rakhine State, and they started doing a lot of the, like narrative and conceiving a lot of Rohingya community and to participate in pressuring them to participate in anti-Arakan army protests, and we have seen in March in 2024, and also and the Myanmar military when they started having the forced recruitment and exploitation, like they started recruiting the Rohingya community, particularly in the Rohingya refugee camps and displacement camps inside Rakhine State, and also because of this tension increasing Arakan Army and Myanmar military. At the same time, a lot of the Rohingya community where they were in between and they were caught up in between. At the same time, Arakan Army, they started, having a lot of these um, a lot of these violence and which is already investigated by the different human rights organizations and the human rights violation which is committed by Arakan Army. And so we have seen a lot of changes happening and a lot of changes happening within Rakhine State. So we wanted to explore particularly for this policy brief, and also because of the fragile coexistence has been and changes, we wanted to see more about what is the implication for the citizenship. So that is where we started when we talk about these citizenship, and I think the uh, citizenship, we had to start the question as like Matt said, a lot of the legal dimension about the citizenships. And but I think it's also important to highlight the citizenships, as we all know, it's like, legal citizenship from this legal perspective is like civil, political, and social rights. And also we usually grant them through documents and legal recognitions and access to courts. And so however, within the Arakan Army control areas and within in Rakhine State and in the post-coup context, we can see the Rohingya are still lacking all the legal foundation of citizenship. And also, like SAC, as mentioned, Matt mentioned a lot of the 1982 the citizenship law, and they still use that citizenship law and also to discriminate and to exclude the Rohingya and from the citizenship. But also in the post-coup post-coup, the SAC started to use using the Pankin registration, which is also excluded Rohingya entirely. Because Pankin registration is basically they are actually asking the people in Myanmar and also other unofficially recognized ethnic groups and to register and civil registration. And the civil registration and household registration is also very important part of the the citizenship application. So in the Rakhine states, and particularly the Myanmar military, they use the registrations, and so many children who are born after 2021 in Rakhine State, and particularly the Rohingya communities, and they were unable to register. And so there's a lot of the frustration within the communities, and because of they do not have the generation and the legal records. And also for the Arakami, but they are literally, we could definitely say that they had de facto authority within the Arakan Army control areas, but they do not have the citizens providing legal, like citizens providing legal documents and like providing like identity card or citizenship. At the same time, we have seen that there's so many law. Actually, the Arakan Army is dormant from colonial and post-independence. So the other day when I was talking to the some of the local people in Rakhine State, so some people, they were very unsatisfied and unhappy about the Arakan Army legal system because of some of the law they are obviously using the same law that Myanmar military used in colonial and post-colonial the legal framework at the same time. Even though they are still trying to, get away from the Myanmar military, but the legal system is still from the colonial and post-colonial. So at the same time, because of that, many of the Rohingya community, they stay lack of the judicial protection and protections. And so when the Rohingya community, if they wanted to have these like legal mechanisms and support and protection, they said many of the people do not get the impartial and independent legal mechanism. At the same time, most of these legal and law and legal system and all are dominated by the Rakhine and elite, and so like they had this like authority to decide and to make the decision. So basically the Rohingya community, they do not have any authority or any changes in within the systematic bias in within the Arakan Army legal system. Also, and because of these consequences, I think also Matt already mentioned, like if you do not have legal recorded identity or citizenship, there's a lot of the disadvantages and consequences. And also because of that, they cannot access to public services and property rights and even freedom of movements. And we all know that, like in Rakhine State at the moment, if they wanted to go to one place to another, they need to get the permission for 1 day permission, and which they had to pay like 3,000, 5,000, which is about $1 or $2 AUD per day. And so also it depends on the which area they are in, the territory they are in. So these practices are differences. And also I think that some people might highlight this, like, a lot of positive change happened in post-coup context in Rakhine State because of some of the Rohingyas being participated in UNAA administration. However, it is like also really questionable whether they are being really included because of they desire the rights or because they just being symbolic and very instrumental for the effectiveness of the administration. And so there's a lot of questions in terms of the legal citizenships under the Arakan Army. But in this particularly, I also would like to highlight the point that citizenship is not only about the legal dimension, but also particularly in the Rohingya issues, I think ethnic identity is really also very important. And I think some of the scholars also debate about, like citizenships and definition of citizenship itself is also very contested, and also the ethnic identity dimension in the citizenship. So in the case of the Rohingyas and post-coup Rakhine State, I think the recognition of ethnic identity is still really challenging, and because all the Arakan Army as well as the Rakhine leaders and also civil society leader who I had talked to many people, and they all really refuse to recognize the Rohingya identity. And at the same time, going back to, Rohingyas are not legitimate ethnic groups in Rakhine State, but despite some of these histories and also the history, and they interpret it in different ways. So it's still so much challenges, and also the most difficult areas which I think and need to be addressed if we even succeed in the revolution and the post-coups and like revolutions and Rakhine becoming self-determinant or autonomy, or if it even happened, there's a lot of questions to us about this ethnic identity issue. And so in earlier, like I said, 2021 and 2023, the language in the Arakan Army even encouraging Rakhine people and like Rakhine community to avoid the term, like Bengali, which is also very sensitive and offensive, and also foreignness to the Rohingya community. So at the same time, they were using Muslim instead of Bengalis. But in 2024, and even Arakan Army leaders and also some of the en route figures, like they started using the Bengalis, and so a lot of tension is started again. And obviously, and the question, and and also in Rakhine State, right at the moment, from 2024 to 2025, and when the Arakan Army, the UNAA officers and administrator, when they wanted to record resident, the household registration, so they use a Muslim, not the Rohingya. So there's a lot of questions like how much the recognition of ethnic identity for the citizenship is going to be a big issue. And also, it's also contradictory because for the Rohingya perspective, the recognition of identity is really essential because it's just like citizenship is like really inseparable from the recognition. So a lot of different tension even stay there in the post-coup dynamic. So I think the implication is like, yes, like and legal recognition by Arakan Army. They do not have legal authority or like they are not independent yet, but at the same time they have de facto authority, like household registrations or identity, not identity gap, but is some form of the registration in the everyday life. And but at the same time, they do not want to recognize the Rohingya identity, and they rather you Muslim, and so there's a lot of question in that dimension as well. So, however, I think that for the political citizenship, like citizenship is not only about the legal or identity dimension, but also the relationship and agency and representation. So, in the Arakan Army, like I said, like they started including some of the Rohingya leaders in for their local administrative, but at the same time, it's really pragmatic and not really right based. And also, our UNAA, they actually claim, and it's also like a lot of in media interview as well in my research, and they said they are building the nation building and inclusive administration, but at the same time, a lot of like they had this Muslim affair, ethnic affair, and so but some of the Muslim community, Rohingya community, they are welcome that engagement, and some are also cooperate because of the necessary, because of in everyday life. And but sometimes some people they are stay distrustful for the Arakan Army local governance practices. So I think also when we look at it, the Rohingya organization, we also seen that a lot of evolving in the post-coup context. And so the Rohingya Consultative Council, which is also established in March 2024, but still we haven't seen any engagement with UNAA. But at the same time, we also seen emerging Arakan National Rohingya Council in earlier this year in July, but they are aiming to unite the Rohingya voice and advocate for identity and citizenship. And so a lot of things still happening, but we hasn't so sure like how these organizations are going to work. Are going to be representing the Rohingya community inside and outside of the Rakhine State and Myanmar. So there's still a lot of questions to be asked and stay ongoing. And also, and one thing I would like to highlight today is but many of the Rakhine actors, including civil society, political and group leaders, they also were aware that in order to have the like multi-ethnic political stability in Rakhine State, they really need to cooperate with the Rohingya community. But at the same time, they also were aware that Rohingya community and they really need to be recognized as a citizen, and they need the citizenship. So all the armed groups and political leaders and civil society leaders, they really they want the Rohingya citizenship at the same time, but they do not want to recognize the Rohingyas as the ethnic groups. So, but at this stage, I am not quite sure how they are going to grant the Rohingya as a citizen without recognizing Rohingya as a ethnic group. So that is the question, but state need to be asked, and state need to be questioned. So thank you so much. I think yes.
Thanks so much, Sophia. And I know that your research is, based heavily on almost real-time discussions and conversations with people on the ground in Rakhine State. So it's a real finger on the pulse of what's going on in the States. We're very fortunate to have this insight. Um, Thank you so much. It's really, you can also see how some of the issues and intricacies that Matt has raised feed into, or potentially could feed into, some of the dynamics that are playing out in Rakhine State at the moment. So fortunately, we have a little bit of time for questions. I'm sure that those of you who are on the call have probably need some more time to digest these two very rich presentations. But nonetheless, we have 20 minutes. So here's your opportunity to, I guess, challenge Matt and Sophia, agree with them, or offer your own reflections based on your own research, even if that's in different contexts. But there may be some parallels that can be drawn here. I have a couple of questions of my own, but I will reserve my those till a little bit later. Does anyone like to ask a question? If you could just use the raise your hand function, and then maybe we'll take a couple. And if you could also, if you could, sorry, when you pose your question, if you could just quickly say who you are and where you're dialing in from, that would be great. And to the extent possible, switch your camera on as well so we can see your faces. Thank you. Yeah, go for it, Christoph.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Two excellent presentations. I'm Christoph from Macquarie University, and I would have questions to everyone here, but maybe starting with Sophia. So I'm interested in what is currently the practice in non-government controlled areas in terms of the ongoing functioning of, let's say, civil registration and ID card production. Are insurgencies, like groups that now non-state groups that control these areas, are they still keeping government officials in place and they are still issuing birth certificates and ID cards to people who become eligible for these kind of documents? Or are there different practices across different non-government controlled areas that some groups have started doing their own documents? I'm interested in just the diversity of how this is currently being conducted in non-government controlled areas, including in Arakan, where you do, in Rakhine State, where you do a lot of your research. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Christopher, for your questions. And actually, the practice has been really diverse. For example, when we look at it, there are currently states, and they are also having a lot of these civil registrations, and also, I think identity card, and they issues a lot of stuff in particularly recently. But at the same time, I think but as some of the it's not like a like passport or national identity card they issues, because of say these are, I think, under the SAC control. So I think, like, for example, like Arakan Army, like they do the civil registration and household list, and but at the same time, I think like they do not have the power or authority like to issue like like national identity card or like citizenship card. But I think that's also one thing that I think some of the civil society leaders and activists in Myanmar are advocating. Like, if these the non-state actors in like Rakhine or like Karens or Kachins, like if they started issuing these documents, identity documents, and maybe the SAC or either I mean SAC or even like international community should recognize that kind of identity documents. And at this stage, like like no, not really any other authority are willing showing any willingness to recognize. And also that's one thing, like I think that local editors are really trying to advocate for it, because in for example, because of in the post-coup dynamic, and because of the tension between SAC and Arakan Army, even the some of the ethnic groups, and not even the Rohingya, even like like being Rakhine, like they are being also really difficult to get the such a like identity documents. For example, like my own family, like my brothers and sister, they wanted to get out of the Myanmar and they wanted to go abroad, and but the problem is we can't get the passport because of my dad also shared the Rakhine identity. And so it's a lot of tension, but at the same time, they like Arakan Army and non-state actors like Arakan Army or other actors, like they do not have de facto authority yet. But I am hoping that maybe at some point, and I don't know how this is going to turn out, but particularly like where established like governance is currently states, and I am hoping that something happen, because of this some of the people literally becoming like more statelessness, and because of they don't have the identity documents, they don't have passport, they don't have national identity card, they cannot go to the Myanmar government and ask for the identity documents, and at the same time, and they can only go to non-state EDA, but non-state EDA, the documents are not being recognized internationally. So there's a lot of questions. Yeah, but thank you for your question. Yeah.
Can I just jump in and add to that something?
Yeah.
Which
Go
is,
for it, Mike.
I don't have any current information on the registration practices used by the different armed groups. But I think what Sophia has just described is important for us to take a moment to anticipate what could happen in the future if the revolution is not successful and the military is able to reconsolidate control. And we can do that also, I guess, me wanting to look at historical examples again. Because it won't be the first time in Myanmar that the state has had to deal with long periods of time where it did not have control over its territory. After independence, it was really only controlled Yangon or Rangoon, and the rest of the country was mostly not under its control. And so hundreds of thousands of people have been born that were not registered in any way because the government didn't control the territory, because our government offices were not functioning, etc. And so I think one way for us to look at the current citizenship regime is as the state's strategy for managing that reality, which is that after the fact, it has to deal with registering and controlling and really scrutinizing and monitoring, surveilling its a population that it hasn't had a good handle on previously. And so, I started thinking about this actually when I was reading part of Sam's book on talking about the difference between categorization and classification. And so, if we think of the 135, the list of 135 as a system of categories, then there's the secondary question, or the next question is how to classify people within an individual person and how do they fit within those categories. It's kind of a classical distinction, category versus classification. And I think there is a deep investment in the categories of 135 because almost everyone in Myanmar recognizes the absurdity of trying to classify any individual in terms of a category. And that's why if you look at somebody's ID card, many times they will have like a list of many different nationalities of their whole family, like 3, 4, 5, 6 of all of the different ethnic nationalities that they and their family members are, which is, Sophia's describing the problems that can create, like it's causing for her family. And so everybody understands that it's completely absurd to try to classify anybody within this system. And I think that the way that that's been dealt with is to double down on the stability of the categories. And so over the last 20, 25 years, for example, as the NRC cards or the CSC cards were rolled out, it was easier for you if you could present as Buddhist and if you could present as a member of one of the groups that was not a suspect community at that moment for whatever reason. You were not a member of a community that was associated with insurgents of some kind. And so the reason I think this is important for us to think about as we can anticipate a potential grim future is if the military is able to reconsolidate control and you have potentially hundreds of thousands of people who do not have documentation because they were married, they moved, they lost their paperwork, they had kids, and they are not registered in the current system. In a future in which the military has reconsolidated control, those people will be attempting to register themselves under the current regime, the 1982 law. They'll be attempting to get registration cards, they'll be attempting to get passports, all of that. And I think we could probably see a renewed investment in that system of categories because we're going to have another moment where the classification is impossible because people don't have the documentation. And so the way that you deal with it as a parent, and people tell these stories, you can find hundreds of these. It's so easy to find these stories. If you're Christian, for example, and you don't have the paperwork, you're dealing with the fact that you need a passport, you want to get an ID card for your child. When you go to the office, you present as Buddhist. You talk about yourself as Buddhist. You look like a good Buddhist Bama. You try to present as that, and that will pave your way in the interaction with the government official to get your documentation. Now, that's just a moment, and you can say people put on whatever hat they need to put on to try to survive the moment. But as this happens over time in generations, this is how people invest in this structure. And so I think if this SAC is able to reconsolidate control, what will happen after that is probably a deeper reinvestment in the categorical system that has excluded the Rohingya. And that's what we don't want. So I suppose that's a third reason why I think rehistoricizing these categories and challenging these categories right now is so important because that potential pathway forward in which the SAC consolidates control, it's grim for many, many reasons, but this is just another one.
Thanks, Matt. Sam, you've had your hand up.
Radha, thanks so much, both of you, for the presentations. I really appreciated both of them. My question really is for Matt, around, like, I mean, we've talked about this before, and I find this, like, as Radha said, like a very compelling analysis. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about the concrete opportunities that it opens up So, like in a different kind of a context, that might be something that you could use in strategic litigation. That does not seem to me possible in the current regime, or like not worth the effort in any event. Like, are there other kind of practical things that could be done with this kind of insight that would change anything? And I guess that like there's two different kinds of answers you could give. One would be other examples of things like litigation, like these kind of technical procedures that really um, underline the incoherence of the position that has been taken. But then there's also, and like you showed this with your some of the photos that you put up, like other opportunities for pluralism in less kind of formal structured ways, I guess. Like, yeah, I'd be interested in answers of both of those kinds.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm thinking, I've definitely been thinking in a kind of diffuse sense of organic intellectuals, kind of like the ways of thinking, the ways that we have these conversations. If the category that is in the Federal Democratic Charter is not itself defined socially, to the extent that we can work to redefine it, sort of through the back door, we've begun to alter the terrain that the whole citizenship debate and the Constitution even operates in. Yeah, so that's how I'm thinking of it. Strategic litigation, I mean, inside Myanmar, the law works in very funny ways. But honestly, I do think that there is potentially a line of strategic litigation which says that there's never been formal government authority to define the Dayan list. So according to the citizenship law, you needed the authority of I forget what it's called. It's in the paper. It's like the governing administrative council or something that is formed under that law to define who the Tayantas are. And then it said, and then when the new constitution came into force in 2008, that was passed over to the president. But no one has ever produced any documentation that says that that was actually defined under legal authority. And so when the deputy minister conceded as much when he was asked in 2014, where does this list come from? And he said, oh, well, it was announced in the Working People's Daily, but it was not announced according to any sort of formal edict. Now, one thing that Myanmar lawyers, people who debate about the law in Myanmar love is precedent and our little tiny arguments about the source of authority and the basis of a decision. And so it is actually completely plausible to me in just like a bonkers way that I never thought about until you asked it, that somebody could bring a lawsuit in Myanmar and say, actually, the list of 100, there was no legal authority for the list of 135, therefore it's open. Now, a president could then, or the military general could just, with the stroke of a pen, has the authority now just to affirm it, right? But it would expose the absurdity of it, I think. So that's I suppose, a strategic litigation opportunity. I'm really interested in the kind of opportunities for pluralism in less formal and structured ways that you're pointing to in the second example. Yeah, and I think as intellectuals, as scholars, as practitioners, we can contribute to this by changing the way we talk about citizenship, by affirming over and over again that when someone points to the list of 135, they are realigning themselves with the State Law and Order Restoration Council in the 1990s and the years after. And we can stop doing so. For example, Christoph shared Nini Jha's amazing chapter, which I could have just like summarized the first section, the bits of that chapter, which talks about sort of the Rohingya moment and the four things that are happening that are maybe opening up opportunities for the Rohingya, and would have made the first third of my talk much faster. And Nini Jha does exactly the best case scenario that I've seen any scholar who's talking about this do, which is he says the list of 135 begins being implemented in 1989. But he actually doesn't say it that way. He says the new law begins being implemented in 1989. But then he uses passive voice earlier in the article to just say that the Rohingya have not been recognized as members of their category. And so it's this continually papering over the ambiguity as if it's not ambiguous. And so I think the first step is for us to stop participating in that. And maybe, I don't know, and you asked me before, sort of why do people keep making this mistake? And I think maybe it's a lack of confidence to say, well, surely there must be just some evidence that we haven't found yet. Like there's documents out there that say it was defined earlier, just nobody knows about it. It's so deeply embedded now. Surely it's been there all along. Like the possibility of sustained ambiguity, it's like it's hard for people to accept that it could have, because that's not how states work. It's certainly not how the Myanmar state seems to work, but it's definitely been there all
How
along.
all states work. All states work on that.
It's
We
absolutely
just don't
it's
acknowledge it.
absolutely how all
If
states
you
work.
work out how to disseminate that kind of more critical approach to thinking about the list, please let me know, because I feel like I've been shouting from the mountaintops about this in the context of Kenya for many years now, and it has changed nothing. Like, people read the work and they say, oh, it's great. Yes, you're so right. Kenya's 42 tribes really are blah, 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 like just in the same breath. And I think that, like, the depth of, you used the word investment in these imaginaries is like very difficult to overstate and like incredibly difficult to overcome. I agree, like we can start in scholarship, but like, yeah, I guess I'm quite interested in how the more kind of policy oriented, legal oriented statelessness community or anti-statelessness community can adopt that in a way that might like help it disseminate more widely. I don't really know how to do that. And I think it's a very interesting conversation to be having.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think they're really cool projects like the Et Calais visual archive that has been set up to document histories of Rohingya life in Myanmar is really amazing. And it does this in kind of an indirect way. And so I should probably talk to them about like, could we add a section to that archive which is about the many versions of the Dayantha category? Just like I mentioned, there's all of these other lists. Like let's just put like the poem that I shared in my slides. Like let's just have lots of those up there. Because as soon as you start seeing it, you realize the diversity of the ways of conceptualizing ethnic nationality in Myanmar beyond this one that becomes dominant. So so we could promote those.
Well,
One
Greg
other one,
also
I don't know,
worked
and
in Kenya, so maybe we should get him onto that too.
sorry.
Greg also worked in Kenya back in the day, so we should get him onto that too.
That sounds like a project. That sounds like a collaboration right there. The other one, and this is not my place to propose, so I'm not proposing it. But for example, the 1973 census, which had 144 groups on the list, it does not include the Rohingya as such. It includes a group that is referred to as Rakhine Chittagong. Now, would different Rohingya political parties be willing to accept citizenship in Myanmar under Rakhine Chittagong while maintaining their political activity as Rohingya in a way that is similar to, for example, the Kachin? Many of the Kachin groups do not use Kachin as their ethnic category. They operate under other terms. But Kachin is how they are recognized in the Myanmar Constitution and on their ID documents. And so would that be something that Rohingya political parties would be open to? And then would that be a means to avoid some of the deadlock around the sort of intractable 135 and just say like, well, the only person who ever used 135 was General Samong and Than Shwe. So let's erase them and just go back a decade to 1973, which had 144 groups, and then nobody has to debate it. And in this sort of, again, that kind of weird Myanmar obsession with precedent, could we just go to this 1973 census list as opposed to the 1983 census list? So would Rohingya political parties and different members of the Rohingya community, would that work for them? That's not something I can answer. But it does, like, as ways to try to get around this deadlock, let's just try to jettison 135 and say, oh, what are the other sources? Or never mind, let's just go to that. Let's just use the Shootout newspaper edition. Instead of Working People's Daily from 1990, let's use Shootout from 1971. Can we use those kinds of documentary artifacts as a way to kind of break the deadlock? Sorry, I'm going on long, so I want to make sure others have questions.
Thanks. Amit, you've had your hand up, and then there's a question from someone in the chat, but Amit, you go first.
Yeah, thanks so much. Maybe I can start by introducing myself. Can you hear me? Okay, great. That's brilliant. So I'm Amit, and I'm based in Bangkok, and I cover statelessness for UNHCR's Asia Pacific region. Amazing presentation. Thanks so much. I had to dip out for a moment, so I may have missed something. What I wanted to ask about is that we have partners in Myanmar, legal aid partners, that have informed us that they estimate that up to 11 million non-Rohingya may have no documentation of their identities or nationalities. And I previously covered Syria for almost a decade. So I'm familiar with some of the fears of approaching authorities in the context of international human rights law violations, including forced conscription and potential retaliation from not only de facto authorities, but potentially other sources. I guess my question is there any analysis around the status of this population, this undocumented non-Rohingya population, and potentially their situation and risks of statelessness currently and post-conflict over. And I would love to talk to you more and learn from you. Thank you.
You should, yes, there is a little bit. So Izzy Rhodes, who's at Lund University, I don't know if you've seen her work, and the organization Mosaic Myanmar. They have a couple reports on this just in the last few years on the non-Rohingya stateless population and the way that this is increasing radically now as you don't have control of large swaths of, as the state does not have control of large swaths of its territory. So if you did a search for Elizabeth Rhodes, Rhoades, she's actually a member of this network, but she didn't join today. You would find her work, or Mosaic Myanmar. They do incredible work, really, really top-notch field work in Myanmar and legal analysis. And they're analyzing this circumstance, and they've developed some really cogent recommendations that are specifically for this topic. And in some ways, maybe kind of to Sam's question, I think they're offering one of the avenues forward, which is to emphasize that the question of statelessness and the many problems of Myanmar's current citizenship regime are not only problems for the Rohingya, that there are problems for many, many people. So I think the really great thing about one of Izzy's papers, or Dr. Rhodes's papers, is she goes through in very concrete terms the many different kinds of people who are being made stateless. So within that 11 million, for example, what are the circumstances that lead you to be stateless? So for example, if one of your parents joins one of the revolutionary groups, is not able, you can't name them on your in the documentation process. Then when that child is born to an unidentified father, they can't confirm that the father is a Dayantha. The result is that the child of that member of the revolutionary movement can't become a citizen because they can't confirm that both parents are members of Dayantha, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just all of these knock-on effects from the way that the law works that make potentially millions of people stateless. Now, the Rohingya have been targeted for ideological reasons, and the law began being weaponized against them in the 90s, right? And the ideology that targeted the Rohingya becomes a national ideology in the 90s. There was anti-Rohingya racism before then, of course, but it becomes uniquely important in the post-socialist moment. And that's the intersection that leads the 1982 law to become being used against them in new ways. But the law has always been a problem for many people. It's just the Rohingya has had this sort of sharp end of the stick, as it were. But yeah, check out Izzy's stuff and the Mosaic Myanmar stuff. It's very good. And if you can't find it, please send me an email and I'm happy to share it with you.
It's hugely helpful. Thanks so much.
Sophia, did you want to add anything to that question from Amit?
Oh, no, actually, Matt covered pretty much. Yeah, I also follow with the Moses and the Elizabeth Rose work. And yeah, I think the question is like really important, particularly like 11 million people who are being statelessness and all not only the Rohingya issues, and that's really big questions. And I think the Mosaic, like they do a lot of and recognize and I mean officially recognized ethnic minorities, and which is also I think in the case of Myanmar particularly, and this has to be a lot of the research and it has to be a lot of conversation about that too. So which is really good, yeah.
Thanks. So we're 5 minutes over, but this is a fascinating and rich conversation going on. So if everyone's happy to stay on for another 5 or so minutes, I'd like to have our speakers have the opportunity to address someone with his question, which is basically, whether or not we should be looking for a solution in legal terms to statelessness only when the process of statelessness has both been a legal and sort of social one. I don't know if either of you would like to tackle that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. That's why I agree that Natalie's book is just exceptionally good. So let me respond to this. I think your question prompts two things. The first is that my point is not that we should be looking towards the law as a source of solutions necessarily, but that when we say there is also a social process of making people stateless, that this has been tied up to the assumed legitimacy of that law. And every time we repeat the idea that the Rohingya have been excluded from legal citizenship because the law defines them as outside of the category, we're repeating a falsehood because it does not. And so we need to be clear about how that legal fiction was created. The legal fiction was created by the Myanmar state and when it was created. And the second point is that the law does deeply matter because it is used as a part of the social and the political process of stripping the Rohingya of citizenship. So and Natalie's book is our evidence for this. So I would definitely say read Natalie's book very carefully, and you'll see over and over again the documentary barriers that are raised to deny Rohingya citizenship are based upon a legal and bureaucratic infrastructure that invokes this law. Now, the Myanmar state works in all kinds of violent and abusive ways. It does not comply with the law in a way that we might imagine if we were imagining a kind of liberal democratic state. But it is never or very rarely a state in which it just ignores the law. It uses the law. The law is weaponized in all kinds of ways. And so the 82 law is just perfectly positioned to be weaponized against a target population. So as the Rohingya have been made into that target population, the 82 law has been used against them. So as long as the 82 law exists, as long as that is the legal basis for defining citizenship, it will be all but impossible to make citizenship for Rohingya in Myanmar. Abolishing that law, replacing it with a better law, does not solve all of those problems. And I think actually Izzy's work is incredibly important on this. Elizabeth Rhodes' work is incredibly important on this, and as is Natalie's, because Natalie's book, for example, shows the many ways in which Rohingya have been divested of the material documents that attest to their existence in Myanmar. Those documents have been seized, they've been stolen, they've been burned. They have been non-issued, so when babies are born, parents have not been able to register them and get birth certificates. And the accumulation of that means any citizenship regime which says you can be a citizen if you supply the necessary paperwork will inevitably exclude the Rohingya from citizenship because they cannot produce the necessary paperwork. So the problem with the different verification and citizenship registration processes, even the ones that have been advocated by different members of the international community, those are impossible for many Rohingya to use because it's a kind of fait accompli. All the documents have been stolen from them or denied to them. So when they get to the moment of registration, they've already lost because they don't have any of it. So I agree with you, it's both a social and a legal process, but I think we'd be very naive if just to say, oh, the law then doesn't matter. We definitely have to deal with that law.
Sophia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I definitely agree that the law does really matter. At the same time, I felt like this is a lot of the like social process, and also, for example, when we look at it in Rakhine states, like l- even like law recognizes, okay, like we changed the 1982 citizenship law, and then the new law technically and started recognizing the Rohingya as a citizen, but at the same time, how these law and like going to recognize ethnic groups. That's also, and then how this community is going to accept then as ethnic groups in Myanmar, and like political communities and stuff is also. So I think both really matter, legal and social process. We had to take into account that both narrative at the same time. I think they are all interconnected, and because sometimes like some of the, for example, in my research, like in Rakhine State, some of the recognized ethnic group like Khmer, like they are also Muslim, but they are minority groups in Rakhine State, and also other than like Chakma, that Mule, they are actually being recognized as ethnic groups in Myanmar. But at the same time, a lot of these like question or the when they go to these and government officials stay to get the citizenship documents, and they are being discriminated because of the minority ethnic groups. So there's still a lot of the discriminations and social process involved, and so probably it does has to do with the both dimension in Myanmar, and yes.
Thanks
Yeah, and
so
I just
much.
wanted just to add that I think I have always read Nini's work actually in the same way. Like it's complicating de jure statelessness, like the whole notion that is always just put forward there with a one sentence and drawing more attention to the actual practices, even sometimes in contravention of the 1982 law that then made the Rohingya really stateless. Like this is how I always read his work. So maybe when he uses this kind of passive voice, it was not necessarily, I have always read it as not necessarily referring to the law, but more the totality of the administrative bureaucratic practices that are associated in implementing a regime of exclusion, essentially.
I mean, the last time I saw it, I think a lot of my work is kind of the addendum to Nini Jaws, or just like the follow-on to a Nini Jaws. He's been incredibly helpful and influential for me. But I would also say, like, look, if you look at that chapter, if you look at the sentence when he refers to it, he is papering over the gap, that 8-year gap where we don't know what happened. And so it's like, and I mean, I talked to Nick at ANU, who's the other person I would sort of think of this work as an addendum to, and he acknowledges the same thing. He said, I just kind of moved on. Once I realized it came out in 1990, I said that, and I never looked back. And I think that's what's happened, is none of us has ever stopped to pause and say, hold on, what did happen in those 8 years? Just quickly to say, Amit, I put a link in the chat to Izzy's paper about statelessness since the coup, for non-Rohingya. The way that Mosaic has developed the vocabulary that they use for this is unofficial or non-official minorities. And so these are minorities who are not citizens according to the 1982 law, but who might be citizens under the lower categories of citizenship. And so unofficial minorities is a useful encompassing term, because it includes Rohingya, it includes people, Gurkha, people who are Hindu of various ethnic categories and things like that. So definitely check that link out.
Thanks, Matt. I do recognize that we need to wrap up, but I just had one final closing question. I actually had two questions, but I'm going to limit myself to one. And it's a little bit of a sort of provocative question, in light of everything that's been said. But if we're talking seriously about, a future in Myanmar where the Rohingya have full citizenship, would require sort of jettisoning essentially the 1982 law. And given how we've talked about how embedded this notion of Tayanta has become, and since 1982 at least, linked to nationality, is it realistic to envision a future nationality law in Myanmar that is not linked to this concept of Tayanta?
What do you think, Sophia? I
Good
have my answer,
question.
but
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Actually, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but like Myanmar is so obsessed with these tying the national race, but I think I think it's also the point that Matt is trying to make the point. We actually really need to reconceptualize or his history read different interpretation in different ways. And I think we just generations that we just really like, I mean, like Matt said in earlier presentation, like in Myanmar, talking about Rohingya has been really sensitive and offensive in day-to-day life. And like even now it's like post-coup. Yeah, in post-coup, even post-coup, a lot of question is like only like elite and political community and who are aware of rights and started talking about Rohingyas issue and citizenship and human rights violation, extra. But a lot of people stay being in, like very discriminated attitude toward them. And so I think imagine political community without like attaching to that tying that concept is still far from away, but at the same time I wouldn't even say that it's not possible. I would want it to be very positive, and especially if we begin like for example we now stay at becoming powerful and becoming autonomy in different state, and maybe like they might have their own constitution regarding the citizenship and regarding these national identity, and then maybe they may not able to attach to that time that concept because of that, because of they are also being discriminated by this concept. So I am hoping, but at the same time, history repeat again and again. Like like we were hoping, like oh, this M group become in power and the solution, their solution to be better community, better democratic, but that non-state actor are using becoming authoritative, and so it's hard to tap. Also, it's really important at this stage because I think I had like some of the like Arakan Army and other Rakhine leaders that they said they are making the constitution, new constitution, and they had almost ready, but they haven't really shown in public yet. But at the same time, who is influencing the constitutions and how they are, like conceptualizing these, like the concept of dying dust or national race and all other things. So I think it's really critical and important time in Myanmar for the future. And so I think every people could play a big role, but at the same time, I think a lot of questions to be asked that I would like to hear what Matt thinks.
I guess Rod, it's such a hard question. So there's three things I want to say. And the first one is maybe some of this research is also a part of as an answer, which is we're not only framing, we don't need to, it doesn't only have to be framed as a kind of revolutionary, transformative future in which the only path for Rohingya inclusion is a broad-based success for the revolution, which is genuinely committed to being inclusive, and it says, yeah, the Rohingya are citizen. The only possible future is not one in which the 2021 NUG policy on the Rohingya is implemented. That'd be amazing. That's the best one. And you can also see why people wouldn't want to do that. That would also feel like capitulating to international demands and Rohingya agitators and blah, blah, blah. So I guess part of this research is also saying you can imagine that entire future occurring in which the NUG saves face by emphasizing it is not capitulating international demands. It is simply returning to an older set of categories because it rejects everything that the SPDC and the SLORC did in the 1990s. And bonus, those older categories just had the Rohingya. And you don't even have to say that. Just like the law doesn't have to say who is and is not included, you could just say, we don't reject the 82 law, which is a problem. We reject the 1990 set of categories and we want to go back to the ones from 1973. That's it. And then a footnote to that is, oh, magic. Now the Rohingya are citizens again. That's kind of nice. The second thing to say is some of the pragmatic difficulties of reconsolidating control and dealing with the 11 million strong potential problem of registering stateless populations is probably going to force the hand of whoever attempts to control the country in the future. And how that plays out pragmatically and bureaucratically in terms of like the dirty work of governance, I really don't know. And especially as the world is trying to shift towards digital IDs and things, which Myanmar is just an absurd place to try to do that. But as we've talked about, many international funders will raise that every time they have an opportunity. So how that will lead to this future, you can again imagine somebody through the back door in good faith or in bad faith really altering the terrain of Rohingya citizenship in that process. And that's the last thing to say, which is that there are other very grim futures in which the military seeks to build a coalition with the Rohingya against the Rakhine and other revolutionary forces, which is exactly what's happening right now. And that as a part of that, forms of citizenship are granted to the Rohingya or promised to the Rohingya if they cooperate in certain ways. And that is absolutely what happened. And there's a speculation on my part in this research, which is that the reason in June 1989 the post-socialist government said the category had not been defined was because they wanted Rohingya political parties to participate in the 1990 election, and they did, and they won seats, which helped the military control the political terrain vis-a-vis the NLD and also the Rakhine political parties. And then, the same moment that it annulled the election, it also announced a new set of categories that excluded the Rohingya. So there's a period, 2 months or to a year or so, in which the ambiguity, and I wish Sam was still here, the ambiguity of the Tayanta category in 1989 served a political purpose for the post-socialist government, which was to allow Rohingya political parties to be some of those that ran and were aligned with the military at that time. So you can imagine those kinds of things occurring in the future, and that would provide a kind of short-term, it probably wouldn't be good and full citizenship, but you can imagine and certainly understand why some Rohingya actors would take that deal as they did in the past.
So fascinating. Thank you very, very much. It's been such a dynamic and interesting discussion, and it's been wonderful also to hear from our members who've got separate but related interest in these areas that you've touched on. For everyone who's on the call, you've now had a good flavor of what these two papers that are coming out very soon will say. So you've sort of had a sneak preview. We hope to publish them in early 2026, and we'll circulate them, of course, to the membership. Just a final note to remind you that if you'd like to review one of those articles for the Melbourne Asia Review, please drop myself or Micah or Christoph an email, and we'll get back to you with the details. Apart from that, just to say that this is our last SAP Research meeting for 2025. Thank you very much for your great engagement throughout the year. We'll be back with an equally scintillating program of speakers and conversations for you in 2026. And hope you all have a wonderful end of the year. Thanks very much again, Matt and Sophia, for joining us. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you
Thanks
everyone for
both.
coming and for your questions.